And we were told, you need to be prepared to go to prison for 2 years.
Wow.
You need to count that cost. And it was mentioned, the reality is that is unlikely to happen.
Yes,
but you
exactly.
will be threatened with it. So if you're not ready to go, and so the manual was a lot of that was security, how to handle interrogation, how to survive if you are in prison, things to do, exercise, really all that sort of stuff, and most of all, how not to give away any details of either the team or the people you're going to visit.
Hi guys, welcome back to Raw Mission, where we hear inspiring stories from Jesus followers whose passion it is to make disciples, plant churches and catalyze movements around the world. I'm Matt, your host for this podcast, and today I've got Ian Nicholson with me, one of the founding leaders of 24/7 Prayer and the Guildford Boiler Room, now called Emmaus Road Church. Ian has some great stories to share about his days smuggling Bibles into communist countries, as well as his involvement in inspiring young people in the UK towards prayer, radical discipleship and global mission. Okay, well, it's great to have Ian Nicholson with me today on the program. Hi, Ian.
Hi, Matt. Morning. Very hot morning this morning.
It is a hot morning. Yeah, today is the day when the UK is sweltering, perhaps one of the hottest days on record. So, yeah, it's everyone's freaking out about the sunshine here. There are places we've lived where this is kind of daily life, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, Ian, it's really good to be with you today. We got to know each other, didn't we, a few years ago when I invited you to come with a bunch of church leaders and influencers to Bangladesh. Tell us a few of your highlights from our Bangladesh trip a few years ago.
What, apart from getting really sick on the last night? And
no, you weren't alone.
No, we let our defences drop, I think, at the last minute on the last night.
Yeah,
mob happy. It was an amazing trip, actually. I would say it's one the memories of and the smells and the experience and the encounters I'll always remember, because it's just such an overwhelming nation. And I think my perception was it was just people, yes. Everywhere, very spiritually attuned and alive. But I found it quite an oppressive trip in that sense, and certainly some parts of it. Meeting with missionaries and just hearing their stories and just such admiration. The poverty. I remember probably the standout memory is standing on a bridge in Dakar over a sort of 6-way highway, three lanes either side, both sides totally gridlocked, and an elephant in the fast lane with a rider, but traveling the wrong way down the fast lane with elephant. And I just thought,
classic South Asia.
This is just a crazy, surreal scene, but surrounded by, it was, in one sense, it was very biblical, surrounded by so many people who had such obvious, visible needs, not just poverty, but physical ailments and so on, and thinking, you just don't see this in the UK in this same way. It's hidden away, or it's in hospitals, or, or people get better. But it's just,
and we only had 7 days there, didn't we? But we managed to see some of the huge urban centers and just get out into the countryside where I think there were just no gospel workers. We went to one place, didn't we, where there was a tiny church. And I still remember the name of the guy, Nathan, I think, Nathaniel, the local pastor there. And he said, we have 6 or 10 in our congregation or something. And that's it. We're the only Christians in this whole region, as far as we know. Yeah. It's quite stunning to think about that.
And also, I mean, the other impact was, I think I worked out that Bangladesh is about the size of Greece. I might get this wrong, but I did some quick research. And its population is like 160 million.
Yes.
And it's not, population growth isn't slowing down. You just think, where is this going to end, and so on. So a real eye opener and a real challenge. It was a lot of fun.
Brilliant. So, Ian, I'd love to hear a bit about your background and your story. Give us a little insight into how you came to faith, perhaps in your younger years, and then how you got into global mission and God's heart for the nations.
I was at a grammar school here in Guildford. Don't come from a Christian, an active Christian background in any way. I remember my parents, when I was about 7 or 8, saying, would you like to go to Sunday school? They didn't go to Sunday school or church, but they said, would you like to go to Sunday school? And I said, no, not really. And they said, that's fine, but we thought we should offer it, because they were of that generation, I think, where they felt it was their responsibility to at least offer some sort of Christian instruction. But they said, it's up to you. So I suppose then I became your typical sport-loving, drinking, socializing sort of sixth former at school. And when I became a Christian, the guy who headed up the Christian Union who's still a good friend, and he said to me, you were the last person I would ever have expected to be interested in Christianity in the whole sixth form. But it was quite a move of the spirit in our school, well, in lots of schools in our area, actually. On one guy who became a Christian, someone said to him, why have you become a Christian? And he said, well, if Ian Nicholson can change as much as he has, there must be a God. So you're not always good at looking at yourself, but there was obviously a dramatic change, and I think it was a dramatic change. So what happened was the pastor of our church did one of these discussion things with the sixth form, where on a Friday afternoon, where it was like we could have a politician or a policeman, and they got 10 or 15 minutes to talk about who they are and why they do what they do, and then we as sixth formers just got to argue with them or ask questions. And this guy, who's quite a well-known Bible teacher called David Pawson, but anyway, he was there, and we just hammered him. And I walked out of that meeting thinking, this poor guy, we've destroyed his faith. He's obviously going to have a crisis now. But there was this feeling going on in me saying, which was totally separate to the argument, which was, if this is true, I need to do something about it. And I was going off into Guildford. I was on the train platform where we lived on a Friday night, the usual weekend of drinking and having fun and what have you. And I said out loud on the platform, I said, anyway, God, even if you are there, I want nothing to do with you. And at that moment, that feeling, which I now would call conviction, lifted, and it went immediately. So then about 2 or 3 months later, again, this was on a Saturday night in another pub, someone said, my friend Graham, who'd been a Christian 2 weeks, is arguing away in the corner of the pub and about his new faith and everything. And I thought, well, I'll go and join in. So I went and joined in. And then again, that same feeling of conviction came, and it happened. It carried on right throughout the weekend. So much so, I remember on the Sunday walking through town saying, anyway, God, if that lamppost falls over now, I will believe in you. And it didn't happen. If that lady slips over now, I will believe you. And it didn't happen.
Interesting.
But I went back to see Graham on the Monday, and I said, I think I might want to become a Christian. He'd only been a Christian himself for 2 weeks, so didn't have the deepest theological understanding. So he said, Christians read their Bible, they don't get drunk, and they ask Jesus into their life. So I thought, right. So I went off, found a classroom on my own, little room, and found a Bible. And I started reading Matthew's Gospel in the King James Version. And of course, all the Bible scholars would know that's so-and-so begat so-and-so begat so-and-so begat so-and-so. So halfway through that chapter, I just thought, I know what I need to do. And I got on my knees in the classroom and I said, Jesus, I don't even know if you're real, if you're there. But if you are, I need something to change my life, and I will follow you. And at that point, I was filled with the most incredible peace. I mean, it was just like it came down immediately, filled me. And for about 2 or 3 hours, I was just zoned out on. I was walking around school just thinking everyone was going to think I'm on something, because I just felt so peaceful. And it was after that I started going to church, and I started going to the church that David Pawson was minister of. And he was encouraged, because he thought that meeting he'd been at was a dead loss and nothing had happened. So to hear that someone became a Christian, and for that first month, I mean, others listening to this will have had the same experience. There was these sharp points of conviction. I remember my friend and I had a big argument with some others, because so many people were becoming Christians at the school, and saying, we were arguing about swearing, because we were still swearing. And I said, so it's just a word. It just adds emphasis to what we're saying, But I found after that meeting, every time I swore, there'd be this little conviction of saying, you shouldn't say that, you shouldn't say that. So and the drinking changed and everything. So it really was a radical change. I know another school nearby, they had so many people become Christians that they almost had altar calls in their school assemblies, and the school actually ended up shutting down to Christian influence because parents objected to.
Wow. Which school was that? Are you able to say?
That was Guildford County. So I was Guildford Grammar. Yeah. That was Guildford County. And then there was Wisley Garden Centre. A friend of mine was in his class of 21 students. And at the start of the year, there were 3 who were Christians. At the end of the year, there were only 3 who weren't Christians. So 18 in that group.
That's interesting, because there's a school here too, actually, where I'm in High Wycombe, one of the grammar schools. I think it's John Hampden, where I met a guy who said, there was kind of a mini revival in his day there, and he eventually was asked not to come back into school in his A-level year. He said, just do the exams and don't come back to school because you're causing so much trouble. So many people are feeling the conviction of sin, coming into the CU, even though they didn't know why they were. And so many were coming to faith. It's interesting, isn't it, what God can do in schools?
Yeah, it depends. I think there are seasons for that you just, I've met my friend Graham, recently, and we agreed it's probably the closest. You don't realize it at the time, but now you think it's probably the closest to revival we've seen if you're looking at sort of mass conversions. So it was 73, 74. So it's the tail end of the Jesus movement. So there's a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of stuff going on, Spree, 73, Lausanne, different conferences and so on. And Guildford had a couple of really vibrant, charismatic celebrations up at the cathedral where apparently I missed one of them, but there were nuns dancing in the aisles and healings and so on. Wow. And it was seen as the Fountain Trust. It was considered to be the first time that the charismatic renewal in Europe had sort of gained an identity in those 2 Guildford Cathedral gatherings. The one I went to was a guy called Cardinal Swainans, who was a leading charismatic Catholic in Belgium, who was,
this is interesting, isn't it, when you think now of and your role over so many years with 24/7 prayer, because there is that sense of, God can work in so many different denominations. He can work in the school. You've got the whole prayer in schools movement, haven't you, as part of what you do? You've got this connection with different denominations at 24/7 Love. And of course, which we're going to go on to talk about, the heart for mission and evangelism that's so central to what you guys do.
Yeah, it was vibrant. And a lot of people from around that time ended up in mission or have ended up as church leaders or whatever. Very close friend of mine, she and her husband worked in Uzbekistan for many years, then moved to central China to work with the Uyghurs and so on. So, you look at where people end up and you see the start. And a lot of it was about the church youth group was really vibrant. There was a lot of prayer going on. Good discipleship training, and then encounters with, at that time, YWAM and OM. Well, OM had been going a little bit longer, but they were really just starting in the UK. So
how did your story connect in with those guys?
Well, we had quite early on. We had YWAM came to run an evangelistic cafe in Guildford as part of the church summer. So we were out.
Just in case people don't know what YWAM and OM mean, tell us who they are.
Operation Mobilization is OM, started in the late 50s, and missionaries all over the world. Very, very radical. It was radical in the 70s when I was with them, but there were stories from the 60s that would make your hair curl, in terms of just young, on-fire Christians looking to live the gospel, really. And YWAM very similar. They came from different roots. So I think YWAM really would have a more of a Pentecostal sort of like origins, whereas OM would probably be more brethren. And YWAM would probably have more of an American flavor in a lot of places, certainly at that time. But again, like OM, very radical in terms of looking to really live all out for God and to see the world change. So as a young
and being willing to go anywhere, really, as well, pushing the boundaries of where church would go.
Amazing stories. Both had amazing stories that fueled the movements. And so I was really taken with that. So I initially applied to go with YWAM. The thing about new movements is they're not always great administratively, so they lost my application form, and I ummed and ahed about the summer, and then I got the option to go with OM, who at that time were doing summers in France and saturating France really. So I went on the team to Corsica, and I remember when they came up, they said, "Oh, this is a bit of a hardcore team. It's going to be a week longer than all the other teams. Blah 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 blah. We're going to do it by interview only." And I thought, well, I've got to get in there quick because everyone's going to go for that team. And in the end, they didn't. So I was just thrilled to be part of the Corsica team. We went through the whole of the north of the island with evangelistic books and literature, and did open airs in Marseille and then in Corsica as well, down by the harbour. And it was just, I mean, when you look back on it, you think, was it a lot of it naive? Yeah, probably it was. And, you know, but as a young Christian, it's what young Christians need, a feeling that you're changing the world.
Exactly. They're formative times, aren't they? Yeah, they teach you about faith. They teach you about prayer. They teach you about boldness, and then seeing people respond and, the needs of the human heart.
Yeah, it is. You feel you're making a difference, and that's what young people want to be, as world changers. And and whether Christian or non-Christian, that's the stage of life it is. So I absolutely loved OM. I then went and did another summer, very different. It was in Bradford, and we went around all the sort of different Muslim communities in Bradford, trying to make sense of the literature and making sure you were giving someone the right language. I remember we were invited by an imam to come to his house and discuss what we believed and so on. And we did that, and we took advice on whether we should, and we went and did that with, and there were a couple of their young guys there. To this day, I'm not sure, was he really interested in what we believed, or was it more of a fact-finding mission? But again, it was great. And by that time, it was over that second summer that I'd made the decision to join OM. So, at that time, the plan was to go to India. Again, it was a similar thing. They said, "Oh, India is the hardest place on earth. You know, it's going to be really challenging." And you had all these stories. And I thought, well, that's where I'll go. And it was quite a challenge with my parents, who are lovely, but not Christians. And having that discussion, I remember my dad saying, "Do you realize your plans to go to India? How long are you going to go for?" I said, "Well, probably life. I'll probably come back for holidays and things like that occasionally." And of course, you just, and he said, "Well, do you realize what you're doing to your mother? She's upstairs crying now, So anyway, I wrote a letter to my parents from university just before I went with OM to Bradford. And I just said, I have made up my mind, I am going to India, blah, blah, blah. And then I rang up my mum, and she said, "So you've made the decision to go?" She said, "Well, we just want to let you know we don't agree with what you're doing, but we will support you doing it."
Wow.
And that was a real turning point. And for me, the turning point was I felt I'm now my own person. I'm not living my life with my parents' agenda. I'm living my life according to my own heart, which I think is a key phase in growing up. And the reality is they met a lot of OMers and they loved them. And I ended up going to Vienna and not India, which probably helped as well.
Yes, it's funny because our listeners, some of the younger listeners, will be thinking, "Well, it's so easy to travel and stay in touch. Why is that such a big deal?" And it still is today for parents seeing their young folks deciding to go do crazy things around the world, and that is scary for people who don't know the Lord, especially, and think, "What are you getting into?" But back in those days as well, in what 70s? Are we talking 80s now? Back in those days, internet connection wasn't there and mobile phones, and so it was a much bigger deal. Your parents are thinking, "We might not see you for 2 or 3 years or hear from you much by the odd phone call," or so on.
And the limit to their travel at the time was probably Spain or France in a summer. Anywhere outside of Europe was very, very unusual. But you're right. I remember, when I was driving the vans with the OM team in Vienna in Yugoslavia, and the van broke down. I had to hitchhike to the nearest town, put in for a call back to base to get the mechanic to come down, and you're sitting there for 2 hours waiting for that call to be connected. And then the some of the stories about going to India, these guys in the 60s they got these old removal vans and they cut a few windows in them and just all bundled into the back and drove all the way out through Iran, Afghanistan.
That's exactly what our founder did, Greg Livingston.
Yes, he would be. Yeah,
his biography, You've Got Libya, and he tells these same stories. I mean, he and George Verver were cut from the same cloth, weren't they? The leader of OM, leader of Frontiers, and they did that kind of crazy thing back then. They just drive, and they had no idea what they were going to encounter on the way. When they'd get there and so on. But
I think I heard that when they got to India, George Verver allowed them all to buy a Coke as a treat.
That's right. Oh my goodness. Okay, so India was what was on your heart, and you felt a leaning to go there, and your parents, were beginning to work through that huge decision, because India is a very tough country to go to. I spent my gap year there when I was 18, and I've known folks who've worked there. They've worked in West Africa, East Africa, and India, and they said spiritually India just feels so different and dark compared to some of the places they lived. But how did it switch for you from India into Europe?
It was probably the clearest guidance, among the clearest guidance I've had in my life, really. I was so set on India. I'd had the injections. We were talking about where I'd go and everything. But then the just kept coming this little doubt about, is this right? And it came from nowhere, this feeling inside. As you can probably pick up, I'm quite a feeling-led person. And then some people kept talking about Austria and Vienna, and that would give a spark of, I don't know what it was. It was just, and then I thought, no, that can't be right, because I don't speak German, and it doesn't sound that exciting, to be honest, and all this sort of stuff. But eventually I met a guy, and he said, oh, what are you going to do? I said, well, I'm going to go to India, but the more I think about it, I keep having these thoughts about Vienna. He said, well, I'm on that team. I think you'd be really great on that team. I think that you need to speak to this person. So I knew this person a little bit. I'd met him the year before. So there's about 400 or 500 people in this conference. So I was doing my prayer walk around the grounds in the morning, and I said, well, Lord, I will go and see John, but I'm not going to seek him out because I'm fed up with wasting people's time. You need to bring him to me. And at that point, I just looked up, and he walked around the corner.
Wow.
And on his prayer walk. So I stopped him and said, could I come and see you later? And then we met later, and then he said that what happened is, just after seeing me, he walked across the football field, found a name tag on the ground, and it was, I'd lost my name tag, and he found my name tag, and he said, I don't put huge store on this, but these things can sometimes. And then they began to tell me that in Vienna at the time, OM had this Eastern European team, which was a secret team. George Verver, he knew it existed, but he didn't really know all that happened, because he didn't want to, because he would end up talking about it from a platform somewhere. But and they did Bible smuggling, supporting the church behind the Iron Curtain. They were starting a new literature evangelism team, which they wanted us to be on in the first year, and so that was that. So I decided to join this team, and I wouldn't need to speak German because most of the work was out of Austria, and turned up, and there's this team of families, about 100 people, people building the vehicles to smuggle, people handling the literature, working in partnership with a lot of the well-known Eastern European missions to actually take their literature for them. And the first thing you do pretty much in your sort of induction is you write a letter to your parents that gets sent in case you get arrested, which is, dear mum and dad, hope you're well, don't panic, but I've been arrested in,
interesting.
Russia,
So that's
Bulgaria,
interesting to know, because
Hungary.
sometimes we think back and think, they didn't have crisis management teams and much preparedness in some of those early OM YWAM days. But actually, that's good to know that you guys had thought ahead a little bit and done some preparation for crisis.
There was a little bit, and there was a whole manual about that, well, about 2 or 3 inches thick, that you had to read once a month as a member of the team, and it was all on best practice and good practice, most of which had been added to the manual because people had made mistakes, and they thought, right, we need to add that add that to the
Yeah.
manual.
It's biblical to count the cost and to be ready and not to be,
Definitely.
we can respond in faith and do crazy things, but we don't want to be foolish. So it is good to learn the lessons, isn't it?
No, I think one thing I liked about that OM team was there were a lot of very practical people, because I was a little bit of a super spiritual, recently graduated student, never done what people would call a proper day's work in their life, just and so to have people around you who are quite down to earth, quite gruff at times, some of them, but it was good. It was good because it was the reality. And we were told, you need to be prepared to go to prison for 2 years.
Wow.
You need to count that cost. And it was mentioned, the reality is that is unlikely to happen. Yes, but you will be threatened with it. So if you're not ready to go, and so the manual was a lot of that was security, how to handle interrogation, how to survive if you are in prison, things to do, exercise, really and all that sort of stuff. And most of all, how not to give away any details of either the team or the people you're going to visit. So the first year I was on a team of three of us, and we went all over Poland, basically going into blocks of flats at night with gospels and putting them under everyone's doormats. Wow. We would do some personal evangelism in Czechoslovakia on the route through. And then we did a bit of that in Hungary as well, got thrown out of the Karl Marx University and so on. So we covered all of Poland. And then in the summer, we did a similar thing with literature going down through Yugoslavia to Greece. And that was where a team the year before had been arrested and imprisoned in Skopje for a month, Skopje, Macedonia, North Macedonia. And the year I did it, there were two teams. The other team were caught and they went to prison in Skopje for a month.
Really?
We weren't. So we spent a nice few weeks on beaches in Greece and then made our way back. But that was, and then the second year I was asked to be the driver for one of the smuggling vehicles, which was a converted Ford Transit, which was nicknamed the Arab. Took about a ton of literature every time. And it had been built in the late 60s. We were in the late 70s doing 2 or 3 trips a month. Built with secret compartments all over, false floor, false headlamps, false walls, a false skin to the vehicle so that when they knocked along the sides, it didn't sound super dead. So that was
cool. I love it. This reminds me of course, the famous Brother Andrew and God's Smuggler. Was this all happening at a similar time to what Open Doors were doing?
Yeah, so our team would have started in the late 60s, led by a guy called Dale Roton, and he was one of the original OMers. But he remembers going to Russia and with a group of young people, and they were smuggling Bibles. And just before they left, someone pointed to there was a gap between the bench and the wall, and you could look through and see the Bibles in there. So Dale, I think they just hung a coat over it, to cover it. And that was in the late 60s. By the late 70s, the authorities in these countries had got a lot more sophisticated. So we actually took a lot of books in for Open Doors. So what Open Doors, my understanding is that what they did is they focused on the summer when obviously you could turn up to a Romanian border and there might be 100 cars waiting and they get a very cursory look. Whereas we would often go to Romania in January and we'd be the only foreign vehicle possibly at a border all day. So they would really rip the thing apart and look. So it was just the vehicles we did I thought were incredibly well built, but for year round supporting the church. So we take in Bibles, New Testaments, hymn books, commentaries, all sorts, really, just to resource the church.
Yeah, because at this time, it's hard for us to kind of think back those few decades, but at this time was the church in those kind of countries pretty underground generally?
It varied in different countries. There were higher levels of freedom in some, but all were persecuted. I mean, I have a friend who's East German, who's leading a church now in East Germany, and he recalls how as a kid he wasn't part of the communist pioneers like the communist youth Boy Scouts, which everyone else had to be, but your parents could take you out. So he was publicly humiliated in school. So, there'd be things like, you're all going off to the lovely trip to the zoo, but Ralph's not going because his parents are Christians and they won't let him,
Interesting.
And then also meeting, say, in Bulgaria, meeting a guy there who'd been a university lecturer, but because of his faith was made in his mid-50s to work on a building site and with his body failing. And so lots of things like that. Russia was obviously much harder than that. A lot of the leaders of the underground church there wouldn't see their families for years. They would live on the run.
Yeah.
And they would pop up here. They'd have reunions every so often, but because the authorities wanted to arrest them, sometimes they would even, take children away from Christian families and put them with other sort of horrific stuff.
Very sad.
Romania was pretty hard. There was a lot of persecution. And the Securitate, the secret police, were pretty violent. And then Albania, where I never went to Albania, some of my friends did, but that was considered the first atheistic country in the world and was the most closed. And only a few people could get in. Yes, it was genuine persecution. But fantastic people. I say to people, they said, "Oh, it's so brave what you did." And at the time, you don't really think it is, and I don't think it was particularly. But the believers in country, it genuinely was brave.
Yes.
Because if we were caught, the chances are we'd be thrown out because they don't want the embarrassment.
Yes, exactly.
Believers in country for.
Yeah, I always say the same actually about working in the Muslim world. There were dangers in Pakistan. I mean, for sure, I've got stories of friends in terrorist attacks and some who were, held at gunpoint and different things, some kidnapping that went on. But overall, life was fairly okay for the foreigner in Pakistan. And it's the local church that have more institutional persecution. And then it's the new Muslim background believers who, they're in danger of death or are being cut off from their families in so many different ways. But we as foreigners usually would just be pushed out of the country if we upset the locals or the authorities. But obviously that tapped into something in you, that sense of adventure that was a part of you, as well as your gospel calling and your understanding of how this Jesus is for everyone all over the world, and there shouldn't be barriers to people hearing about him. I think is it Brother Andrew who used to say, when the door is closed in front of you, go find the window. I don't know if that was him or if it was, or perhaps that was George Verber. But I think, frontiers have the same philosophy. There are barriers to the gospel, but, with prayer and with a bit of adventure, we can, why not? Let's find ways to get round the barriers or get through the barriers.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it really locked into something in me. I suspect it's in a lot of other people as well. I remember being surprised at university because to me it became so clear that, the call to the nations was a core part of discipleship, and everybody should find their place in that call. Yeah. I remember being surprised that in the CU at university, I think only about 2 or 3 people were seriously looking at just not going into their job. Most were just, well, this is the job I'm going to do, and this is my life. I'll get married and settle down. And that sort of filled me with a bit of dread at that stage, actually. I thought, I don't want to just get married and settle down. I want my life to count,
Yes, exactly. And you're right. It's part of discipleship. It's hard. And I think this is one of the challenges. Some people say, well, why are there so few men, in the church perhaps, or on fire for God? Well, I think it's sometimes because we're lacking a battle to fight or lacking an adventure to fulfill. And I'm not saying that's not true for women as well. I think all of us, we are called to be, there's something we're called to be that's just more than enjoying God in church on a Sunday morning. There's something out there that I think taps into all of us.
Well, I think I remember thinking, looking at our church, seeing, lots of nice cars and families, and I remember thinking, so I've become a Christian, so is this it? And so unless you became a church pastor or, there wasn't really much else to do. Maybe you could lead a home group or something like that. But that seemed to be the height of aspiration. And I'm not disparaging that at all. But I just felt, there's got to be more to this. Yes. And at 21, I was leading a team, small team in Yugoslavia, handing out gospels very naively, and my friends were getting arrested. But I thought, well, none of my peers at home, they were probably still attending a youth group and doing various bits and pieces. And that is not meant to be critical, but it is what I felt at the time, that there's so much more, so many Christians have got to give, and there's no outlet for it really, and yet in mission there's so much outlet for it.
Yes, exactly. And I think the young believers around the UK, maybe we can chat about this later on, but they have caught something, haven't they, with this whole strong desire for justice, and even at a sort of basic level with someone like Greta Thunberg, she's realized there's a battle to fight. Now for her that's climate change, and for some people it's social justice issues, or fighting against the trafficking of women across the world, or modern day slavery, and that's good. These are justice issues that are very close to God's heart all throughout the scripture. But all of us can find something in God's kingdom that should be a battle for us, that should be an adventure for us to tackle something. We're not just passive recipients of good news. We're blessed to be a blessing, some say, like that, isn't it? We've received something, we want to give something and find an avenue. And there are so many things on God's heart that we can jump into. Global mission is one of them.
Totally.
Great. Well, let's move forward then. So you spent a few years doing all of that in Eastern Europe, and then how did your direction move back to the UK?
Well, I came back to the UK. I think the sort of work we were doing was, it's quite hard to do it intensively for more than 2 or 3 years, because there's a lot of near misses, maybe, getting arrested, but even the isolation of the life of living a little bit secretly, you thought you don't want to do that forever. So it was a strange one, really. I got several offers, if you like, from different organizations or within OM to go, and they were all really exciting. And I went back, and Peter Maiden, who was at one time passed away recently, but leader of OM, I was with him, and I just went into quite a deep depression, and I was struggling living in Manchester. I don't know if the two were connected, but but I spoke to Peter, and he said, I think you should just go home for a spell, just reconnect with your parents, just settle. So I went home, got a job on a building site, and for a month. And I remember feeling guilty about taking this job for a month, because I thought there's someone else on a job, and I'm going to be going off here, there, or everywhere soon. And for whatever reason, it just never happened. I ended, and then I worked on the building site for probably 9 months, which I absolutely loved, and then got a job with a TV company run by a guy in the local church, and I became a manager, an area manager, and did that for about 4 or 5 years. Okay. And then got to a point where there was still this thing of, I want my life to count, I want to move into ministry. And so I met Jackie, we got married, and so we were on this journey together, started looking at, do we go to East London, do we move overseas? And nothing quite happened. And then at one point I resigned from my job, a step of faith really. The lunchtime before I resigned, my boss rang me up to tell me I got a 20% pay rise.
Interesting.
And I didn't tell him that I had just that in that lunch hour written my resignation letter. and so left that. And then I thought again, just now I've made this big sacrifice for God, he's going to show me what to do. And it didn't happen for about 2 years. I ended up working in a electrical warehouse, doing just odd jobbing. By this time I'd be in my early 30s. We'd have a child. We had our first child, Ross, and it really led to quite a lot of soul searching, a lot of prayer, a lot of angst. And at one point I remember going to a church meeting, and the lady leading the meeting said, the Lord wants to say to someone tonight, well done, good and faithful servant. I was sat in the back row, and I just cracked and started crying, weeping. And I don't really cry much, but I was weeping. And in that I said, Lord, I've tried everything, all I'm going to, and the key thing I think I said was, Lord, I've given up trying. I don't want to be on platforms. I don't want to be well known. I don't want any of that. But if you can find something useful for me to do in your kingdom, I'll do it with all my heart.
If you're enjoying this podcast, why not give us a 5-star rating?
so that more folks can hear these inspiring stories and join us in praying, sending, giving and going? Or how about inviting me or one of my colleagues to speak at your church? I'd love to hear from you. Email me on matt@frontiers.org.uk. And now back to the podcast.
I remember going to a church meeting, and the lady leading the meeting said, "The Lord wants to say to someone tonight, well done, good and faithful servant." I was sat in the back row and I just cracked and started crying, weeping. And I don't really cry much, but I was weeping. And in that I said, "Lord, I've tried everything, all I'm going to," and the key thing I think I said was, "Lord, I've given up trying. I don't want to be on platforms. I don't want to be well known. I don't want any of that. But if you can find something useful for me to do in your kingdom, I'll do it with all my heart." And I think that was a turning point. And I've spoken to a lot of people around a similar age who have that sort of breaking experience, I think. And then it transitioned from then. Things began to open up in the local church. I still took, every year I took teams abroad. So that was still there. And I remember, so, if the challenge of in your early 20s is, are you prepared to serve the Lord anywhere?
Yeah.
I think in my 30s it was, but you now need to find somewhere. And I think a little bit of, you can't serve the Lord in China, in India, in Africa, in Pakistan, in America, and at home all at the same time. You have to nail your colours to a mast and be somewhere. So there was always the willingness to move abroad, but once the kids started coming along and different things, and then I remember a key word someone brought me about, the relational collateral you built up in Guildford is not something you can build very easily or ever again, probably. So use that, So at that point, I think I looked to sort of focus on Guildford, but then also and leading the church, but also even in that, finding mission outlets locally, as well as taking teams every summer. We went to Mostar in Yugoslavia. I took 4 or 5 young people to work there before the fighting in the 80s.
So, did you become a church pastor at that point, or were you just involved?
Yes, I was on the leadership team of Guildford Community Church at the time for probably about nearly 20 years, and then the senior leader for the last few of those. But also, I was very much involved in town-wide stuff, seeing the church work together. And it was very much a conviction that grew that, we need the whole church in any geography to have the fullest impact.
Ooh, I like that. You mean the church is working together in a city? Is that what you mean by that?
Yes. More than a leadership fraternal, tea and cakes and seeing how everyone is, but actually saying, we need to have a shared vision for our geography.
Nice.
If we're going to really see the full gospel impact. And at that time, that was very strong in Guildford. It was, and a lot of initiatives emerged out of that. We started a charity called the Matrix Trust just over 20 years ago, which was all about mission to young people in our town. And I'm glad to say it's still going. In fact, it's flourishing at the moment. So it's always nice when things you start are going long after you've really actively been involved.
And how does this all tie into the rise or the birth of 24/7 prayer?
Well, we started these youth mission events in Guildford, meeting in a local nightclub on a Sunday evening called the Warehouse Project. And they were great nights. So, at one time we were getting 700 people along to them from all over the southeast. But it's a long story. But anyway, it created a real momentum in Guildford for youth work. And then there was a whole group of people looking at what does it mean to plant church in youth culture. And through that, I got to know some of the people in Chichester, Pete Gregg, Roger Ellis, and so on, who are leading the church there. And Pete and I connected in particular. We I had a sabbatical, went down, spent the day with him walking his dog, and we just brainstormed mission and Europe. And for those who know 24/7, Pete had an open vision as a youngster of armies of young people rising right across Europe.
Wow.
And then he got in touch with me saying, my wife and I are just going around Europe on a fact-finding tour for a month. When we get back, could we talk about how you can help us with mission into Europe? And to get things started. And by the time I really saw him next, 24/7 had begun. So he was challenged by the Moravians in Herrnhut, who prayed for well over 100 years non-stop, and obviously became a major mission-sending movement.
Yes.
And came back and said to his youth church down in Chichester, do you think we could do this for a month? And they ended up doing it for 3 months, non-stop prayer. And in that, the emails, it was early days of emails, were buzzing around with all the networks of people saying, this had this answer to prayer, that answer to prayer.
Oh.
Others began to pick it up. And then the idea was, do you think we could fill a year with non-stop prayer in the UK?
Wow.
And that was mentioned at a conference, like a church doing a week, handing on to another church. And I went up to Pete afterwards and said, Guildford, we'll do one of the weeks, definitely. And he came back a week or so later, said, well, could you do the launch week? So Chichester had been going for a few months, but then the actual official launch of the Rotary, if you like, was in a Guildford, one of our nightclub events, about 400 people there. And just a real call to prayer. And then as we came out of the nightclub, the red moon was in the sky, and that's how it becomes Red Moon Rising.
Yes, which for our listeners who don't know, that's the key book that Pete Greig wrote. The first, was it about the launch of the 24/7?
That was the first. There were two stories about the movement. One is Red Moon Rising, the origins and so on, which is now, even 20 years on, has just been translated into Polish, and we're doing it there. So it's still got a lot of life in it. But then Dirty Glory is the follow-up, which is more stories. And what I
loved, sorry, just briefly, what I loved about, I didn't read Red Moon Rising, but I have read Dirty Glory, and what I loved about that was it's in 3 parts, isn't it? Really, it's justice, prayer, and mission. I've probably got that in the wrong order, but I just love that emphasis that 24/7 prayer has. What, that always integral to what you guys have done has been, yes, prayer movements and young people, social justice, but mission as well, the gospel, going out.
Yeah, they're great books, and I'd recommend both. I mean, an old friend of mine in OM that was with me in Vienna, he got in touch, and he'd read the book and immediately bought 50 copies and just gave it out to all his leaders, and it's had that sort of impact on groups. So I think very early on we realized that it was a prayer movement, but most of the people in at the beginning were quite mission orientated, weren't particularly intercessors.
Yes.
And I'm very strong on the fact, I think prayer had become a bit of an elitist activity for people who, went to certain conferences and usually had a real God-given calling to deep intercession. But it can tend to take prayer away from us ordinary Christians because we don't know the language, don't get, someone would say, I was praying and I saw this vision and that vision and heaven was open, you think, well, that doesn't happen for me. I prayed and fell asleep after half an hour, So I think I think it was very much a mass prayer movement, and people suddenly realized, I can pray my hour as it fits, with my personality, with where I am and so on, and then hand over to someone else. So a Nigerian Pentecostal can pray 1 hour and an Anglican contemplative can pray the next hour.
Yes.
But it's all Jesus-centered prayer. And certainly early on, I mean, the first week in Guildford, I went in, I think there were over 200 people took part in the prayer room over a week from 20 different churches. And you walked in at 4 a.m. and the room was alive with 5 or 6 people sort of going for it, and people were, said they were filled with the Holy Spirit. There were non-Christians going into the prayer rooms and just sensing the presence of God, which very much chimed with the experience of the early prayer rooms as well. So from there, Pete said, why don't we do some mission teams? So we took our first 3 mission teams to St. Petersburg, Ibitha, and Delhi.
Okay.
In the first year, and then from there, probably about 10 years of mission teams every year to different places.
Brilliant, and of course, Ibitha's become a stronger long-term work as well, hasn't it?
Yeah, Ibitha's still going, and what was interesting with Ibitha, I took the team to St. Petersburg, just an excuse to go back to Eastern Europe, and we were doing street work and everything. And I remember one of the Russian brothers in the prayer room came out and he said, I've had a vision for the people in Ibitha. And it was from 1 Kings 17:18, Elijah, the prophets of Baal, and the encounter, and then the heavens being closed. So I texted the person who's leading the Ibitha team, Kerry, and said, "Oh, we've had this word for you tonight. Don't know if it means anything." And it was very early on in text, and then what we heard was that in Ibitha they had just finished an open air worship meeting in July, and the pastor, the vicar of the local church, he said the biggest encouragement we could have had was actually rain. We'd had no rain really on the island for 3.5 years, and we'd had no rain in July for 25 years. And as that open air worship meeting ended, the rain began, and it swept the island with torrents. I mean, there were storms, and in July. And someone said they'd been praying for Ibitha, and they'd had an image of the streets in San Antonio where all the bars and clubs are and everything, and like water rushing down, brushing away all the rubbish. And she said, I thought it was just a spiritual dream of what God was going to do spiritually. But in fact, the next day, it's what I saw physically, floods of water going down the street. And it hit the news headlines. Then Radio 1 got in touch, BBC Radio 1 in the UK, and they interviewed Pete to say, "Oh, we hear that there's rain in Ibitha and that you Christians are claiming you've made it rain because you prayed." And he said, "No, we're not saying that at all. What we're saying is it hadn't rained for 25 years in July. It hadn't rained for 3.5 years. We prayed and it's rained." It's up to you to make your own mind up.
Join the dots in your own way. Yeah, exactly. I love that. And just for our American listeners, because we do have a lot of stateside listeners, Ibitha is, how would you describe it to someone who doesn't know what Ibitha is?
Ibitha is the party island of Europe, really. It's the landing. It's the landing strip. I mean, for those in America who know, where disco and everything came from, Studio 54 in New York, which was notorious really for all sorts of things, was where disco began. And then its landing point in Europe was Ibitha.
Okay. So it's clubs and raves and young people. Yeah. It's like spring break on steroids, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It's isolated in just, I mean, some of the biggest nightclubs in the world are there.
Yeah.
But then the area we were is like the real, just 2 or 3 streets really in a place called San Antonio. There's sort of, pubs and clubs and drunkenness and everything. Don't let that put you off Ibitha. It is the most beautiful island, and it really is. We've been there a few times, and it's also the rich and famous. It's where they all go and take their yachts. Really elite as well. So but we were focusing on club culture and youngsters.
Wow. So Ian, just to draw this to a close a little bit, I'm going to change tack pretty fast now, and just as we look at the UK church, as we look at the needs of the nations, who knows what the next 10, 20 years are going to bring politically, economically. Things are changing pretty fast, aren't they, in these last few years with the pandemic and war in Europe again. But, none of us can see everything going forwards. But how do you see the UK church and just the needs of the church responding to the Spirit of God? And what's your dream? What's your prayer? And any kind of tips for young people who are thinking, what should I do with my life?
I think, let me think a moment. I think there are always aspects of the church you can be encouraged by, which can be a bit of a downfall because we home in on the bits that are encouraging and tend to block out the bits that aren't. And as we know, a lot of the mainline denominations are struggling. The black majority churches are doing well. But it is a challenge. So the first thing I would say is I think we need to love our churches and love our church leaders, and because it's not easy, and particularly for those who are leading churches in Britain now is very patchy. There are areas that are still fairly Christian, with a good number of churches and people. I mean, Guildford would be one of those.
The Guildford Bible Belt.
I don't know if it's a Bible Belt anymore, maybe, but it's there are proportionally would be more Christians in this area, and then you go particularly up in the north of England or to the west and so on, and there can be areas that are like a spiritual wasteland. So the first thing is Britain, if we're going to be responsible for our own geography, then church leaders need to have a mission vision for their own country. It's not enough, in my view, just to say, well, we built a really healthy church, growing church with great stories where we are. Part of the challenge is, but what about the areas where there's nothing?
Yeah, definitely.
And it's often, I don't mean to sound critical, but I think church planting movements often seem to focus on the places where there are probably quite a few churches already, probably because it's an easier ask to sort of start a church in those areas. So I think we really have to, which probably wasn't quite the same 30, 40 years ago, but we need to have a really strong mission vision for the unreached communities in our own nation.
Yeah.
And the same would be true certainly of a lot of European countries. I don't feel threatened by immigration at all. I think it's a great opportunity.
Yes,
it's exciting.
Amen.
And greater is he that is in us than he that is in the world. So why would we be frightened or worried? So we would see all these things as just a great opportunity. And I would love to see young Christians having that as part of their discipleship challenge. Not only what are you going to do with your life, but where are you going to do it? I think that is just as important a question as what.
Yes.
And
I'm
Keith Green, who had a big mission influence quite a while ago now, before he passed away, but he would say that people who stay need as much clarity on why they're staying as people who go.
That's right.
And I think that therefore it's people finding their place mission wise. And the exciting thing is, I think it's a lot more varied now. I think you can be a business person, you can be in all sorts of things and find your place in God's mission. And that's probably a change from 40 years ago as well. And I think as part of that, I would love as well, with young people and their discipleship, to be getting that challenge of where do you fit in the world? And for many, you can now fit into God's world in your own nation. But for some, it will also be, well, let's go. And I do think short-term mission has a positive part to play in that, because I think it gives an experience. And the number of people I know in 24/7 who are now in the Middle East or different places, and when you say, where did it start? It began on a short-term mission where they encountered God.
Yeah, me too. For me, it was Albania in 92, Eastern Europe, just after communism fell there. That was my first short-term trip. Then it was Morocco. Got that, Muslim thing. Gosh, these guys are open to the gospel, but why are so few people going? And it turned into long-term work. So I agree. Short-term is important.
I mean, that question of why are so few people going, I think it can be frustrating, but I do know the other side, having led a church. You're always short of people. You're always short of resources. There's always ideas you have that you need people for.
That's right.
But it means we're not as aware of other opportunities that people could be doing. And so I think giving away should be a key part of our church life.
Yeah, that's right. That's the sort of the Antioch factor, isn't it? There was a book written a few years ago. It's that, do I step out in faith, release some of our best people, knowing that God will replace and bless our fellowship here? But it's a good word. There's post-Christian Europe, and there are a lot of young people thinking about post-Christian Europe and the Jerusalem, the Judea, the Samaria, those perhaps from different backgrounds coming to our nations, which is a blessing and an opportunity. And then there's the ends of the earth as well. And we are called to all of them, aren't we? And OM have definitely got that in their DNA, and YWAM and 24/7. So Frontiers, that's why, we get on so well with you guys, because we have all this DNA in common. And it's just the heart of God, isn't it, for all people? Great. Well, Ian, thank you so much for sharing your stories. I hadn't heard a lot of those stories. So it's been a pleasure to be with you today. Thanks for sharing. And I know our listeners will be really inspired by that.
Thanks, Matt. Happy listening, everyone.
Okay.
Cheers. Bye.
Thanks so much for being with us today, guys. I really want to encourage you just to take a minute to ask God what role you can play in his mission. Is he calling you to give generously, to pray for an unreached people group, maybe to have a conversation with the leaders in your church about running a Momentum Yes course? To get in touch, do check us out on our website, frontiers.org.uk, and on all social media platforms @Frontiers UK.